Ed Silverberg is a survivor of the Holocaust and was a friend of Anne Frank. Indeed, Ed, you're mentioned in the diary of Anne Frank.
Yes.
She uses the word hello as your name.
Right.
Hello. How did you get that name, hello?
Hello was an abbreviation. My original German name by birth was Helmut, Helmut, very German. And my grandfather, who was a Dutchman, hated that name. And when I was little, he changed it to hello. Has nothing to do with saying hello. It's just abbreviation in his mind of hello. Well, my friends got a hold of it, and it became my nickname. And that's why in my years in Amsterdam, I became known as Hello, and that's how I was introduced to Anne Frank at one point. Then I saw her again, and I guess it became my name. And when her book was published, I found that that's the name she had used. And so that's where that name comes from. I was 12 when I got to Amsterdam. Up to 12, I lived in Germany, was born in an industrial city, and went to a Jewish public school, and until the night of the broken windows, Kristallnacht. And because my grandfather had gone to live in Amsterdam in 1933, that was a natural move to try to get out of Germany into Holland. And I was familiar with the trip. And my grandfather and my father had a running argument, and had to do with the politics of Hitler. My grandfather was born in the Netherlands, spent most of his life in Germany, happened to be on a business trip in Amsterdam the day Hitler was elected, called my grandmother the next morning and said, "I'm not coming back. Move everything out to here. I already rented an apartment."
Why did he have this immediate concern about
Well, there was enough indication. There was enough of an indication of the possibility of future problems before the Nazis took power. There were a lot of problems in the streets. People were beaten up. They already walked around with brown uniforms, the SA. So it was an existing threat. A lot of people just didn't try to ignore it. And my grandfather saw it for what it really was. On the other hand, my father, who was born in Germany, his family had lived in Germany for, I don't know, maybe a few hundred years. Very German. He served in the German army during World War I. Very German, very partial to Germany. And he said, his opinion was, like many people, he said, I don't worry about it so much because the German people will never allow this to continue. He had the confidence in German people that they wouldn't go any further.
So when Hitler rose to power, your
yeah.
father was not concerned?
He was concerned, but he was, thinking and maybe hoping that the German people wouldn't allow him to stay in power. And of course they were wrong. My father lost a bet. My grandfather went to the Netherlands, and of course at one point he said, yes, we left, but we didn't go far enough. And because of that, I spent from age 7, spent all my summers in the Netherlands and back and forth, and to go there after Kristallnacht was, of course, more or less a logical move for us. So I went by myself.
You were just 12 years old.
I was 12 years old. Well, we spent the first night in the city of Essen. We had other Dutch relatives who lived there. Spent one night there, and next morning my parents gave me a little suitcase and put me and told me to get to Amsterdam. It wasn't the same trip, but I had to change trains. Finally ended up on the same train that I used to use with my parents for my vacations. And when I got to the border in a town called Emmerich in Germany, there were 2 young German uniformed guys who took me off the train. I didn't have the red J in my paper, in my little Kinderausweis.
J for Jewish.
Yeah, J for Jewish, because for some reason I didn't have that. But the name like Silverberg was enough, and they took me off, and they didn't know exactly what to do with me. I was on the platform, and the train was about to leave, and they something happened at the other end of the platform that got their attention. They walked away. Just before the train started moving, I jumped on it, and I got to the Dutch border, and where it stopped again, and you know, being a kid, and number one, and speaking Dutch fluently, I had no problems getting in, and got to Amsterdam, got to my grandparents' home, and they couldn't understand what I was doing there. And I told them what had happened. They had broken up my dad's store and the apartment which was next to it, furniture, and my mother was beaten with a mallet. And
Who did this?
They were in civilian clothes, young German guys. It was obviously organized. It happened all over Germany the same night. And Goebbels, it's a known part of history which Goebbels called the revenge of the German people, because a Jewish guy had killed an employee of the German embassy in France. And but obviously it had been, organized well in advance. And some of the men were sent to concentration camps, but were later released, because we're still talking peacetime, 1938. Germany still had foreign correspondents all over the country. So so I ended up in Amsterdam and went to school in Amsterdam.
Why didn't your parents go with you to Amsterdam on that train?
They couldn't have gotten out as adults.
Oh.
My father went to Belgium sometime later, illegally, of course, by having somebody take him to a place at the border where it was possible to walk across. I'm not sure of the location anymore. And he got to Brussels and lived in a rented room. He was an illegal immigrant, like some other people. My mother stayed in Germany a little bit longer to take care of some other business, and tried the same thing as someone with a van, took 4 or 5 people, took the money for the transportation, and drove them directly to the waiting Gestapo. And my mom ended up for 10 days in jail in Cologne, and shared a cell with a German prostitute, and always all her life told us that she learned a lot. And she was released and tried it again. The second time she succeeded and ended up living with my dad in Brussels, both illegals. And I was in Amsterdam, and there was no way to cross borders or to travel, especially when the war started. So I didn't see my parents for 4 years. We corresponded by mail. Things got bad in Amsterdam.
How bad?
Well, first of all, Jewish kids, I was in public school. Jewish kids were no longer allowed to be in public school. I went for a while to a privately owned design school, actually furniture design school, and the director of that school turned out later was an official, an important person during the war in the Dutch underground. And when we were no longer allowed to attend to private schools, he told, there were 2 or 3 Jewish boys in school, told us to come on Saturdays and Sundays to his home, and he would continue to teach us. And so there, and then the arrests and deportations began to take a more formal form. And the first group of people were arrested were 18-year-olds, mostly males. There was the German idea, the Nazi idea of destroying the enemies by destroying the males first. And I had 2 friends who were older than I was, and 2 brothers, one 17, one 18, and they were picked up, went to Mauthausen in Austria, and a few weeks later the parents of my friends as well as other parents got formal letters telling them that their sons had been shot while trying to escape, and if they wanted to pick up their ashes at the Gestapo headquarters on a certain date for 12 guilders, they could obtain them. And of course nobody went for that purpose, because it was quite clear there weren't going to be any ashes that were really their ashes. There were instances of protest. People took chances. One particular instance where a German Jew who was a former highly decorated German soldier in World War I took his decorations and threw them on the floor. And I do not recall what happened to him, but it was definitely, at that point, the deportations became formal. Young people would be registered. They would receive a card in the mail telling you that within so many days you had to pack certain things and appear at a location which used to be a public school in the southern part of Amsterdam. And the pretense was for wartime labor in Germany. Many went, and some didn't. And my grandparents felt it was time for me to try to escape and see if I could make it to my parents in Belgium. And a friend of the family a friend of the family took me to a small town at the border, and he had a connection at the Belgian border. He was a journalist, and at a given moment, somebody in the restaurant gave us a signal, and we went by bicycle across a back road past border guards who looked the other way, and got into Belgium, stayed in a small town called Maaseik, and had to spend the night there. And there was another couple of people with us. One was a distant relative of mine who was a medical student, and his girlfriend, who was not Jewish but decided to go with him. And so the four of us were pedaling, and this was in August of 1942, and they were cutting the corn. At some point, the wheat was being cut, and you couldn't hide anymore. You were in open fields, so we threw the bicycles into a ditch and walked into the next town. Ended up in a little hotel, which was the only one there, and decided the best way to act would be to make believe that you're part of the populace. And I was wearing short pants. My grandfather had shaved a little bit of an indication of mustache so that I would look young. And we went to the movies with a bunch of German soldiers and slept the night. The next day by streetcar went to Liège to an underground safe house, turned out to be later. And I got some false ID, Belgian green cards they have. Then he took me by train to Brussels, to the address where we knew my parents were. And all of a sudden I saw my dad in the street, across the street, in the neighborhood. And I used a family whistle that we used. And I whistled my father. My dad looked around and looked away again because he was looking at a 16-year-old kid, not his 12-year-old. And then he did a double take and looked again, and I waved and ended up in my dad's arms. And the minute our friend, the journalist, knew that I was where I was supposed to be, turned around, walked away. The other couple who had remained in Liège at the safe house made their way to the Swiss border and made it to Switzerland. Survived the war in Switzerland. Later he became a doctor in Amsterdam. And so that was the trip to Belgium, and my parents. And the same thing was happening in Belgium. They were arresting people. People had to be deported, and transports were forming. And Mom and Dad had made arrangements with a lady from the neighborhood to rent a house outside of Brussels in a suburb. And with another couple. The other couple was a man from Nuremberg, Germany, who had owned a department store there. He and his wife, my father, my mother, and myself lived in that house, me in my attic up under the roof, and my parents in another room, and lived there for a total of 25 months. And a couple of the neighbors had an idea of who we were, but we were never given away. And I got friendly with one of the sons to one side of the house, and was able sometimes to cross the road and work in the fields in the countryside, dig potatoes and things like that. So I wasn't completely imprisoned in that attic, although sometimes didn't go out for weeks at a time, but there was always the fear that, so we lived there, and a woman who rented the house was a Gentile woman who worked in Brussels and sometimes was able to find food and kept us supplied as much as possible.
Jumping back, if we could, to Amsterdam and the connection you made there with Anne Frank. How did you meet her?
Originally, I met her through a cousin, second or third, I'm not really sure, second or third cousin. They happened to be of the same family that were living in Essen, Germany, where I spent that night after Kristallnacht. And she was my age, and she knew Anne Frank somehow. It was one close neighborhood. Nobody. A lot of German refugees in the 30s rented apartments there. It's a neighborhood that was developed in the 20s and 30s, quite new, quite modern, and very pleasant, and still very nice today. So we all lived relatively close together. I saw Anne at a bicycle garage. They had bicycle stands, where you housed your bicycle overnight. And this is close to the time when we were no longer allowed to have bicycles. Jews were not allowed to have anything. And then came first, at one point we were not allowed to have bicycles. Then we were not allowed to use transportation, public transportation. They wanted us to be available. So Anne Frank was still in school because she went to Jewish school. And we met at the street where the bicycles had been stored. Her bicycle had been stored, even though it was stolen, but I think her sister's, I'm not sure, I think it was her sister's bicycle was there. And we talked, and the interesting part about that people and people who have written about us have questioned was that I was at that point just about 16 years old, and she was 13. Our birthdays were 4 days apart, and it was somewhat unusual for a 16-year-old boy to walk around with enjoy the company of a 13-year-old girl. But what I've always emphasized, and that's always been in my mind, is that she was exceptionally articulate, something that at that age I wasn't used to. And loved to talk. We had conversations. We saw each other often. Sometimes we saw us in the morning and the afternoon. And there were no places we could go to. Jews were not allowed in movies, in most restaurants, and so it was summertime, so we walked in the street, and there was one place where we could buy ice cream, and went to my grandparents' house or to Anne Frank's house, the Frank family apartment. And that was the limit of our relationship. So, and the whole relationship and the attempt of seeing each other is probably limited to 3 weeks, until her sister got the convocation to report for deportation, and where Otto Frank had prepared their hideaway in the back of his office building. And I had an appointment to see her that afternoon, and and I rang the bell, and nobody came. Nobody answered. And it was a nice sunny afternoon, and I was very sad walking back and couldn't quite understand. But you have to understand, this was a time when people disappeared. And in the back of my mind, I remember thinking that maybe they got away. I knew some vague things about her father's connection with Switzerland, relatives. And I thought maybe they got away. So I went home, and people more and more disappeared. There was another girl who had been my girlfriend for a while, and her brother walked away with a suitcase to report to the Germans. I remember remember seeing him walk away and say hi.